something strange happened in the 1970s. Filmmakers stopped trying to comfort audiences. Instead, they began opening doors to stories so disturbing that some theaters refused to screen them, and some governments tried to erase them entirely. Tonight, we are stepping into that forgotten corner of cinema. 13 films that pushed horror and exploitation beyond every boundary. And as this countdown unfolds, you may start wondering why some of these movies nearly vanished forever. But number 13, The Baby, 1973. By the early 1970s, audiences thought they had seen every kind of horror film: vampires, ghosts, serial killers. But one small independent film quietly slipped into theaters and left viewers with a feeling far more unsettling than blood or monsters ever could. The Baby was not loud horror. It was psychological horror that crawled under the skin. The story begins with a social worker named Anne Gentry investigating a strange family case. She is assigned to observe a grown man known only as Baby. At first, the situation sounds harmless, but when Anne arrives at the house, she discovers something deeply disturbing. Baby is not a child. He is a full-grown adult man who has been forced by his abusive family to live like an infant. He wears diapers. He sleeps in a crib. He crawls instead of walking. The household controlling him is ruled by a cruel mother and two manipulative sisters. They treat the helpless man as both a pet and a prisoner. What begins as a social investigation slowly turns into a nightmare of manipulation and psychological torture. When the film premiered, many viewers did not know how to react. Some critics called it one of the strangest films ever released. Others believed it crossed a line that movies should never approach. But the real shock arrives in the final moments. The ending twist completely redefines everything the audience believed about the story. It is one of the darkest conclusions of any 1970s thriller. The Baby never became a mainstream hit. Yet over time, it developed a reputation as one of the most disturbing psychological films of the decade. A quiet nightmare that leaves viewers feeling deeply uncomfortable long after the screen goes black. Number 12, The Toolbox Murders, 1978. By the end of the 1970s, horror films were becoming more brutal. Filmmakers were pushing boundaries. But when The Toolbox Murders appeared in 1978, many critics believed the genre had gone too far. The film takes place inside an ordinary apartment building in Los Angeles. It begins with a series of terrifying attacks carried out by a mass killer using construction tools as weapons: a hammer, a nail gun, a drill. Each attack feels uncomfortably realistic because it happens in familiar places like hallways and bedrooms. Director Dennis Donnelly built the movie around raw tension rather than spectacle. The early scenes show unsuspecting tenants living normal lives before violence suddenly shatters the quiet routine. The brutality shocked audiences who were not yet used to the slasher boom that would dominate the 1980s. The controversy exploded almost immediately. Critics accused the film of exploiting fear and violence in ways that were morally questionable. Some newspapers demanded the movie be removed from theaters. In several regions, local authorities tried to block screenings entirely. The outrage only increased its reputation. The film became infamous in underground horror circles. When home video arrived in the early 1980s, The Toolbox Murders was quickly labeled a so-called video nasty in the United Kingdom. Copies were seized. Distributors faced legal threats. Ironically, the film itself is not simply mindless violence. Beneath the shocking scenes lies a darker psychological story about obsession and delusion. But that deeper layer was often lost beneath the storm of controversy surrounding its release. Today, the movie survives as a disturbing artifact from a time when horror cinema began crossing into truly uncomfortable territory. Number 11. Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS, 1975. Few films from the 1970s generated the kind of outrage that followed Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS. Even before audiences saw it, the title alone was enough to provoke controversy. The story takes place in a fictional Nazi prison camp during the Second World War. At the center of the film is Ilsa, a ruthless commandant who conducts brutal medical experiments on prisoners. The character is portrayed as a sadistic authority figure obsessed with proving twisted theories about human endurance. The film belonged to a genre known as exploitation cinema. These movies were designed to shock audiences and challenge limits of taste. But Ilsa pushed that formula to an extreme level. Scenes of cruelty and humiliation dominated the narrative. Critics accused the film of exploiting historical tragedy for entertainment. Many countries refused to screen it at all. In others, the movie was heavily censored before release. Despite the outrage, the film gained a strange underground following. Midnight screenings attracted curious viewers who wanted to witness the movie that had been banned in so many places. Over time, the controversy became part of its legend. Today, Ilsa She-Wolf of the SS remains one of the most notorious exploitation films of the decade. It represents a moment when filmmakers tested how far shock cinema could go before society pushed back. Number 10. The Driller Killer, 1979. When Abel Ferrara made The Driller Killer, he was not trying to create a traditional horror film. Instead, he crafted a bleak portrait of urban despair set in the decaying streets of New York City. The story follows Reno Miller, a struggling artist slowly losing his grip on reality. Living in a cramped apartment surrounded by noise and poverty, he becomes consumed by frustration. His paintings fail to sell. His relationships collapse. The city itself seems to press down on him like a weight. As the pressure builds, Reno begins wandering the streets at night, carrying a power drill. What follows is a series of violent encounters that feel disturbingly spontaneous. Ferrara filmed many scenes guerrilla style on real city streets, which gives the movie a raw documentary feeling. When the film arrived in theaters, critics were divided. Some saw it as an intense piece of underground art. Others condemned it as shocking exploitation. The real controversy exploded when the movie reached home video. In the United Kingdom, newspapers used its promotional artwork as an example of dangerous, violent entertainment corrupting society. Authorities soon placed The Driller Killer on the infamous video nasty list. Police raids targeted video shops that carried the film. Copies were confiscated. Distributors faced legal pressure. Ironically, the film itself was never intended to glorify violence. It was meant to portray the psychological collapse of a desperate man trapped in a brutal environment. But the damage was done. The Driller Killer became one of the most controversial movies of the era. Number 9. The Hills Have Eyes, 1977. During the 1970s, horror filmmakers began exploring a terrifying idea. What if the real monsters were not supernatural at all? What if they were human? Wes Craven pushed that idea to a brutal extreme with The Hills Have Eyes. The story follows the Carter family as they travel across the American desert on vacation. Their journey seems harmless at first. A quiet road, endless sand, empty mountains. But when their vehicle breaks down in a remote testing zone, the family quickly realizes they are not alone. Hidden among the rocky hills lives a savage clan that has been cut off from civilization for generations. These people survive through violence and brutality. When they discover the stranded travelers, the desert becomes a hunting ground. What made the film so disturbing was its raw atmosphere. Craven did not present the story as fantasy. Everything feels frighteningly possible. The barren landscape becomes a prison with no help in sight. Audiences in 1977 were shocked by the film's relentless tone. Families on screen were not protected by heroic luck. Characters suffered real consequences. Survival demanded terrifying choices. The movie sparked debate about how far horror should go. Some critics condemned its cruelty, while others praised its fearless intensity. Yet the deeper meaning of the film lies beneath the violence. Craven once explained that the story was meant to show how quickly ordinary people can become just as savage as the monsters they fight. The Hills Have Eyes remains one of the most disturbing survival horrors of the decade. A bleak reminder that civilization is often only a thin layer covering humanity's darkest instincts. Number 8. Last House on the Left, 1972. Before Wes Craven terrified audiences with desert cannibals, he shocked the world with a film so brutal that many theaters refused to show it. Last House on the Left was not simply horror, it was confrontation. The story begins with two teenage girls heading into the city for a concert. Their excitement feels innocent and carefree. But their journey leads them into the path of a group of violent criminals who take them captive. What follows is an experience that many viewers found almost unbearable. The film portrays cruelty in a raw and uncomfortable way. Craven intentionally avoided the polished style of traditional horror movies. Instead, he used rough handheld camera work and harsh realism that made the events feel disturbingly authentic. When the movie premiered in 1972, audiences were divided between shock and outrage. Some critics accused the film of crossing moral boundaries that cinema should never approach. Others argued it forced viewers to confront violence without hiding behind fantasy. The controversy only grew when the story reached its final act. After the criminals unknowingly seek shelter in the home of one victim's parents, the grieving family discovers the truth. What follows is a brutal revenge that transforms ordinary people into something terrifying. Censors in several countries attempted to ban the film entirely. Posters warned audiences that the movie was so shocking they should keep repeating the phrase, "This is only a movie." But that warning rarely helped. The raw realism left viewers shaken. Last House on the Left became one of the defining exploitation films of the decade, a movie that refused to comfort its audience. Yet as disturbing as it was, the next entry would make horror history with almost no blood at all. Number 7. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974. When people remember the most disturbing films of the 1970s, one title almost always rises to the top. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Directed by Tobe Hooper, this film introduced audiences to one of the most terrifying characters in horror history, Leatherface. A towering killer who wears a mask made from human skin and hunts trespassers with a roaring chainsaw. The story follows a group of young travelers exploring rural Texas. Their curiosity leads them to an isolated farmhouse that hides a horrifying secret. Inside lives a family of cannibals who treat human beings as livestock. What makes the film so unsettling is how real it feels. Hooper shot the movie in harsh sunlight instead of darkness. The dusty landscapes and decaying buildings look like places that could actually exist. Many viewers remember the film as extremely bloody, yet surprisingly, very little gore appears on screen. The horror comes from sound design, frantic editing, and the terrifying performance of Gunnar Hansen as Leatherface. When the movie premiered, several countries banned it immediately. Officials feared the intensity would traumatize audiences. Even in places where it was allowed, the film was heavily censored. Despite the controversy, the movie became a cultural phenomenon. It influenced nearly every slasher film that followed. But beneath the horror lies something deeper. The film reflects the anxiety of a changing America during the 1970s. Economic collapse, social unrest, fear of strangers hiding in forgotten corners of the country. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre remains a masterpiece of psychological terror. Number 6. I Spit on Your Grave, 1978. By the late 1970s, horror cinema had already crossed many boundaries. Yet one film arrived that shocked even hardened critics and censorship boards. Its title alone felt like a threat. I Spit on Your Grave. Originally released under the title Day of the Woman, the story follows a young writer named Jennifer Hills who travels to a quiet rural cabin to finish her novel. At first, the countryside appears peaceful. The river moves slowly. The forest seems calm. But that calm hides something ugly beneath the surface. A group of local men begin harassing Jennifer almost immediately. What follows is a series of brutal encounters that push the limits of what audiences were prepared to witness in a theater. The scenes were so intense that many critics walked out of screenings before the film ended. When the movie reached cinemas in 1978, the backlash was immediate. Reviewers called it vile and morally irresponsible. Protest groups demanded it be banned. Several countries refused to allow the film to screen at all. Yet the story takes a dramatic turn. After surviving the violence, Jennifer returns with a cold determination. One by one, she confronts the men who attacked her. The revenge that follows is calculated and merciless. Supporters of the film argued that the story was not meant to glorify brutality, but to expose it. They claimed the second half of the film turned the power dynamic upside down. Critics, however, believed the movie exploited suffering simply to shock audiences. Because of these debates, I Spit on Your Grave disappeared from many theaters and remained banned in some countries for years. Even today, the film divides viewers. Some see it as a grim revenge story. Others consider it one of the most disturbing films ever made. Number 5. Martin, 1977. When audiences hear the word vampire, they often imagine elegant monsters lurking in castles. But director George Romero had a completely different vision. With Martin, he removed the supernatural fantasy and replaced it with something far more unsettling. The story follows a quiet young man named Martin who believes he may be a vampire. Unlike traditional movie monsters, he has no fangs, no supernatural powers. Instead, he uses razor blades and syringes to sedate his victims before drinking their blood. Romero intentionally keeps the truth ambiguous. Is Martin truly cursed, or is he simply a deeply disturbed human being who believes he is a creature of the night? That uncertainty creates an atmosphere of quiet dread. The film takes place in a decaying industrial town in Pennsylvania, where Martin lives with an elderly relative who is convinced the young man is possessed by an ancient evil. Their tense relationship adds another layer of psychological tension. Unlike most horror movies, Martin moves slowly. There are no loud jump scares. The terror grows through mood and character study. The audience watches a lonely man drifting through a bleak world where no one seems able to help him. When the film premiered, many viewers were confused. It did not follow the rules of traditional horror cinema. Some critics praised its haunting realism, while others felt disturbed by its bleak tone. Over time, Martin gained a reputation as one of the most intelligent horror films of the decade. A tragic story about isolation and identity disguised as a vampire tale. Yet the next film on this list would erase any sense of subtlety, because the nightmare waiting ahead would ignite worldwide outrage. Number 4. The Night Porter, 1974. Most controversial films rely on violence or shocking imagery, but The Night Porter disturbed audiences for a very different reason. It explored a psychological relationship that many people believed should never be portrayed on screen. The story begins in Vienna years after the Second World War. A former concentration camp officer named Max now works quietly as a hotel night porter. He lives a hidden life, trying to escape the past. One evening, a guest arrives at the hotel, and Max recognizes her immediately. Her name is Lucia. Years earlier, she had been imprisoned in the same camp where Max served as an officer. Their reunion awakens memories that neither of them fully escaped. Instead of rejecting each other, the two begin rebuilding a strange emotional connection shaped by their shared trauma. When the film premiered, critics reacted with shock. Many believed the movie crossed an ethical boundary by portraying such a relationship. Governments in several countries attempted to block screenings. Director Liliana Cavani insisted the film was meant to examine how trauma can twist human psychology. She argued that the relationship was not romantic, but deeply tragic. Despite the controversy, The Night Porter gained attention at international film festivals and eventually reached a wider audience, but the debate surrounding it never truly faded. To some viewers, the film remains a daring psychological drama. To others, it is a disturbing exploration of power and memory that should never have been made. Number 3. Salo or the 120 Days of Sodom, 1975. Some films disturb audiences for a moment, or others leave a scar on cinema history. Salo or the 120 Days of Sodom belongs to the second category. Even decades after its release, the film is still considered one of the most difficult movies ever made. Directed by Italian filmmaker Pier Paolo Pasolini, the story takes place during the final days of fascist rule in Italy during the Second World War. 4 powerful men capture a group of teenagers and imprison them inside an isolated mansion. What follows is not traditional storytelling. Instead, the film unfolds as a grim ritual of humiliation and cruelty, where the prisoners are forced to endure endless degradation under the control of their captors. Pasolini based the story loosely on the writings of the 18th century author Marquis de Sade, but transformed the material into a political allegory about the abuse of power. When the film premiered in 1975, the reaction was explosive. Governments in several countries immediately banned it. Critics argued the imagery was too disturbing for public exhibition. The controversy deepened after Pasolini himself was murdered shortly before the film's release. His death surrounded the movie with an even darker aura. Despite decades of censorship, Salo eventually became known as a significant work of political cinema. Scholars argued that the disturbing imagery was meant to expose the horrors of authoritarian power. But even those who defend the film admit it is almost impossible to watch comfortably. Every scene forces viewers to confront humanity at its most corrupt. Salo remains one of the most controversial films ever produced, a movie that many people still refuse to see. Number 2. Cannibal Holocaust, 1980. Technically released in 1980, but conceived and filmed during the late 1970s, exploitation era, Cannibal Holocaust became one of the most notorious films ever created. The movie follows a rescue team traveling deep into the Amazon jungle to search for a group of documentary filmmakers who vanished while investigating indigenous tribes. What they discover instead are the lost reels of footage left behind by the missing crew. The structure of the film was revolutionary. Much of the story unfolds through the recovered footage, which appears raw and chaotic, as if it had been shot by the doomed filmmakers themselves. This style later became known as found footage, but at the time, audiences had never seen anything like it. The realism was so convincing that many viewers believed the violence was genuine. The controversy reached its peak when director Ruggero Deodato was arrested in Italy. Authorities suspected the actors had actually been killed during production. To prove otherwise, Deodato was forced to bring the performers to court alive. Only then were the charges dropped. Even after the investigation, the film was banned in numerous countries for decades. Animal cruelty during filming sparked additional outrage that continues to follow the movie today. Despite the controversy, Cannibal Holocaust influenced generations of filmmakers and helped inspire later films such as The Blair Witch Project. But the final entry on this list would prove that the most terrifying horror sometimes comes from a story that feels painfully real. Number 1. Wake in Fright, 1971. Some horror films rely on monsters or killers, but Wake in Fright proves that the most disturbing stories sometimes come from ordinary people trapped inside a nightmare of their own making. The film follows a young schoolteacher named John Grant who is desperate to escape the isolated Australian outback town where he works. His plan is simple: travel to Sydney, enjoy a holiday, return refreshed, but fate has other plans. When Grant stops in a rough mining town called Bundanyaba, he quickly becomes trapped in a spiral of drinking, gambling, and psychological collapse. The town itself feels like a prison built from heat dust and endless beer glasses. Every man he meets encourages the same destructive rituals: drink more, stay longer, forget about leaving. Director Ted Kotcheff filmed the story with harsh realism that makes the environment feel suffocating. The Australian desert becomes a hostile landscape where civilization seems to disappear completely. What shocked audiences most was the film's brutal honesty. The characters behave like real people slowly losing control rather than actors performing scripted drama. One infamous sequence involving a kangaroo hunt left viewers deeply disturbed and sparked controversy around the film's release. After its premiere in 1971, the movie quietly vanished from theaters. Distribution problems and the disturbing reputation caused it to disappear for decades. For many years, Wake in Fright was considered a lost film. Only in the early 2000s was the original print rediscovered and restored. When modern audiences finally saw the film, critics were stunned. What had once been ignored was now recognized as one of the most haunting psychological films of the 70s. Wake in Fright remains a chilling reminder that the darkest horror may come not from monsters, but from the slow destruction of the human soul.